Well, thank you for the nice introduction, and thank you to the organizers for having me here. I'd like to, I hope for those who were obliged to have a very short lunch, then won't regret it. I'd like to present you what we did in the last almost 10 years on the pre-Islamic Raison, like it's usually called. It was a project that started with Ernie Haring and that is still continuing. We're basically talking about the area Edur for the 1st, 2nd century AD, Malaysia for the 3 first centuries, and a tomb in Dibba as well. But the culture progresses along the mountains on this side, and partly in Oman, in the area what Euler used to call the non-Samad late Iron Age, which he now equates with the so-called Pir. Now, when we started in 2009, we had the basic manual from the excavations by the French team, Rémi Bouchalin and Michel Mouton. They did a tremendous work. We could build on that. We started with something, which is always very positive. And Michel Mouton made his PhD on it. It was more recently published in 2008 as a book because everybody was using it. And this is a bit the scheme that he proposed. We have the Pir A, the oldest period, where there would have been monumental tombs which were solid, massive, completely made of mud brick. Then we would have a second phase which had a sort of towers which were open, almost like a room. And then finally in the Pir C, which is best known by the excavations of Ernie Haring in Edur, where we have these subterranean communal tombs, very different from what we had before. That was the idea we started with. All these tombs were plundered, and that's the main difficulty. You have very little good datable material. That's the key thing you want, and it is of course frustrating when you have to start excavating tombs where you know these are all plundered, all the goodies are out of it, and we have to make do with whatever is left by the robbers. It's frustrating, but if you continue digging, you will eventually find what you're looking for. And the datable material that eventually came out was the first a magnificent inscription, bilingual, which most of you will have seen by now, and a whole series of import pieces, Rodion Amphora. And Rodion Amphora are known from about the late 4th century to the 1st century AD. And the big advantage is that they are stamped. They have on one side the stamp of the producer who made the amphora. On the other side, you have a stamp of the controlling instance, a local priest who actually works for the taxes. Using these two stamps, you can very accurately say when these amphora were built or were made. Now, they were made in Rhodos, so the time to ship them, to use them, to deposit in tombs can be quite long. But if you have a systematic repetition in certain orders, then you can deduce some information about the distribution inside the graveyard and the evolution that it had. And whereas in the beginning we only knew a few of these stamps, it later turned out that they cover actually from about 300 or the late 4th century BC to the late 1st century BC. So we have stamps from the whole range of tombs. The inscription was a big bonus because, thank God, it was dated. So we could actually pinpoint it. In the beginning, we thought it was the actual date of the tomb. We will see it was an actual reuse. Now, this is the site itself with the different areas that were excavated, the French. We started out here in an area that was supposed to be the oldest one. It turned out to be different. We'll see it later on. And the area F is actually the monumental tombs where the inscription was later found. The area RV was near to the Wadi, so not the best location to build your tombs because it regularly floods. And it is clearly the later phase of these monumental tombs. I'm showing you here the excavations of a group of tombs in this area. In fact, they continue all along here. We had a GPR done, and you can really pinpoint all these different tombs. You can even see the holes of the robbers going in that went into these monumental tombs. Now, the first discovery we made, and already during the first year, were these bricks lying all around one of these square monuments. So the idea was we have complete mud brick building, a block like 3 meters high, 3 by 3 or 4 by 4, but around it we had all these lime tiles. The same production, more or less the same production as a mud brick. You mix up the lime with sand and so on, and you let it chemically harden, and it provides a very tough material that preserves very well. The inscription, by the way, is made in the same material. We started excavating this heap of stones around it. You see here the base of the mud brick and the plaster around it. And it turned out that we had at some point a complete part of the decoration that had fallen down. And cleaning that, restoring it, you see it here lying as we excavated it, and after the cleaning, we actually had the top crenellations, which we saw this morning as local, well-known. We had a second row of stones, a flat row of stones which came out, which formed a ridge around the monument, and another lane of stones. And then the rest was mud brick. So apparently the decoration on the top was made in a more durable material, probably because the maintenance is much more simple in that way. If you look at the back, we had the possibility to see, you see the circle here, the actual fingerprints going and the lines of hands made into the plaster, which means of the, the drawing, of course, of the buildings we find nowadays, we saw yesterday evening, it is exactly the same. So the first reconstruction we made was this, thinking still in the traditions that Michel had proposed with linking it with Nabatean tower blocks. You had a subterranean pit, a burial chamber, just large enough for the deceased and a number of grave goods, sealed by wooden beams, plaster, sometimes also 2 rows of mud brick, and then this massive tower in mud brick on top of it, plastered around it, and crowned by these lime brick construction, these decorations. Second thing, we were finding these Amphora handles with stamps, which gave us dates for the most part in the 2nd century BC. And we started looking again at the remains that were found by the French team, and more precisely on the other side of the site, closer to the original habitations, area F as it is called. I don't neglect that side of the room. It looked a bit like this at the time when we started. You got these 4 monumental graves. You got the drawing here from the French. And they originally had started out with a trench which had covered a 5th tomb, which they did not excavate because it was very much damaged on the surface. They already had done 4, they knew the material that was in it. And they dated these tombs on the basis of mostly glass that was found here, these vessels, a stamp that was dated to the mid-2nd century, so they thought late 1st century, late 2nd century BC, a later phase than the tombs they had dug earlier. But when I gave this material to one of the specialists who works in Amphora, and there has been a tremendous amount of work in Amphora research, he immediately told me, well, this type here, this handle, that's something that dates from the early 3rd century BC. Now that was the thing we were looking for, that was the period we were interested in. So I decided to take this tomb and open that in the next year. By now we have completely excavated it, and we are doing several trenches all along the area to reconstruct the evolution within the graveyard. This is the actual grave that we excavated, and you see it has more or less the same plan as the room or the burial chamber next to it. It has two rooms, a main entrance from the north leading into the main chamber, and you got inside the chamber a number of pits that served not to put burial beds or anything in, but simply to put in large amphoras. The top, when we cleared it, confirmed that it was an open room. We had actually plaster on the inside of one of the walls. You see the outline of the wall indicated here, and this fragment is shown where we have the floor, the mud brick floor, and the plaster of the inside wall. And then the first year we excavated, we decided, knowing what it must have looked like more or less, we made a cut. We wanted profiles through every sediment that went in there, and that's, you see on the left, 2015 situation. 2016, we cleared the complete room. Now, 2015, we found, we didn't go to the bottom, but we found the actual, we found the inscription stone embedded into the wall. When we finished it completely this year, we broke away the central wall, and it turns out that this big inscription was simply reused as a building brick. So the passage between these two chambers was closed off, and you can see it here in the center by a mud brick, by a sediment for the lower 80-90 centimeters, and on top of that there was a wall built with these hard, durable lime bricks. And with these lime bricks they used the inscription stone. And you see on the top left the 11 rows of lime bricks that were retracted from this top left, and the stone that was taken out the year before. That preserved it. It's the only grave inscription that is preserved in such a magnificent way that tells us so much information. But there are, in fact, like 5 or 6 of fragments known from other places at Malaysia. So they were quite common. The two languages were used, South Arabian and Aramaic. And it cannot be used to date the actual tomb, but it can be dated to date this group of tombs, because they wouldn't have brought it from very far. The second thing that it makes you mention is that the fact that they were available to close this room off as a new tomb means that the superstructures that were built with this material were already in decay. So we are not sure that at the moment that the tomb was reused for a later burial, this tower was still standing. Probably it was in decay, it was broken down, and fragments were taken from it. Here you see the inscription stone still in place. It was the last days of our excavation, so we had to take it out. The text was on the back side, but view the size, it couldn't be anything else. So it was the big gamble, would it be readable or not? After the complete excavation, you see this is the fill. These are the actual walls. The floor of the tomb chamber, that is dug out into the marl. Then you got a layer of gravel, and then you got a construction with boulders. This part is fill after the tomb had been robbed and all the material just went in there. Sand flew in, and that's it. At some time, it started to be reused as a tomb, and they sealed off the back using the bricks from these top structures. So quite a clear reuse. I see my time is speeding up, so this is the inscription. You'll have to believe me, we have the date late 3rd century BC. Same information as before, so I'm jumping to this. This is the reconstruction we actually now use. In section, you have about 1.80 meters the burial chamber. The sides, the top sides made by boulders covered with wooden beams. Then you got these 5 rows of normal mud brick, and then you got the upper structure built in the lime brick, much more durable material, and here also the natural boulders to protect it from the rising moisture. We also have granulations found in the debris, so we can actually say it is the same as the earlier reconstruction that we made. And on the north side is a small platform, and the interpretation by the French team was that it was a sort of offering platform because there wasn't a door visible behind. But in fact, we simply must regard this as an entrance step to enter into the original building. And that forces us to rethink the first reconstruction that we made of the towers. You have to look at it like this. And if you think that only like 30 centimeters is preserved from the lower part, it's logical that you don't have a door because it simply starts higher up. And to give you a comparison that I'm not just inventing that because it's convenient, this is a detail of the temple in Edur, and this is the same sort of blockage in the main entrance of the temple. And top here is a little house that we photographed in the 1980s at Falaj al-Mualla. It is now replaced by a more modern version, but which lacks these details. And you see exactly the same, that you get a small platform and you got a door that is placed a little bit higher to hold out dirt or animals, who knows, but it's certainly the same construction. So we went back to the French excavations, or what was left of it, looked at a number of these early burials or 2nd century burials, and the walls were made like the grave we excavated with these very strong lime tiles. And you can see that the opening between the 2 rows of stone that are used for the walls are in fact very, very wide. There's a lot of mortar in between, and it allows you to narrow down the wall going upwards. So it's exactly the same tradition as we see nowadays in the architecture. The last year, 1 minute 30, I'm hurrying. The last season, 2016, again, in the profile, we found another thing and had to take it out. It was a bowl, and it confirms the early Hellenistic traditions that existed. This is, in fact, a bowl that was excavated by the French team, and it has a number of things that refer to Hellenistic elements. I just want to point out this row of bizarrely crawling people, which was never really explained. This is in fact an Egyptian motif. It are people swimming in the Nile, catching birds and things like that. We have exactly the same on a number of Egyptian plates. Here on the right is the bowl that we found, and I'll show you the complete one in a minute. Just want to point you out the African elephant here with the big ears. And the bowl is in fact a Hellenistic bowl. We got a centaur here on the lower part. You can see it very clearly, a hunting centaur fighting an animal with a curled, an aquatic being with a curled tail, something that we find on several of the bowls in Malaysia. And later on, in a later stage, they added a number of other figures, and these were these African animals. We got, we got here mating rhinoceros on the top here. We got the African elephant, but we got also the Arab fighting a lion with his camel behind him. And I'm running through. A last thing we found in the same tomb, and you see here the mud brick which has descended in the back room. It had been repaired at some point, but in the lower part you got this amphora remains, and again this is a very early Rodion amphora, but strangely enough it has been glazed with a very thick glass glaze, and you can see here the drops locking off, and you see the points of the reglazing. The butt has been removed, something that we also found in another tomb on a Rodion amphora at Malaysia. So that is a tradition. It was actually a Rodion amphora fitted into one of these grave pits. And I'm going to run you through the rest. We had 2 more tombs just behind this monumental tomb. And this one was plundered, left open, sand ran in from one of the corners, and on top of it is just plastered waste through in, and everybody who's ever built recognizes the way wet plaster runs down and gets hardened. So that's quite interesting. This tomb was open, and the area was reused later on. A bit further on, just a few meters, was another tomb with characteristics of the monumental tombs, these large pits, the big flat rows of mud bricks. But very interesting, we got a Spanish amphora, late 1st century, early BC, 1st century AD, typical shape for garum, fish sauce that was being traded. And this tomb combines a number of typical elements from the 3rd, 2nd century, 1st century, with something that we find in the Piercy. So it is really a transition, also in shapes, including these Greek forward curving swords, very typical 1st century BC, 2nd century BC, and this type of vase, glass vase, very typical, no longer in the Piercy. We only have a few fragments, and the only one I've ever found outside Oman Peninsula is in fact a small one in the Louvre on show as being from Tello. So the idea now is that we don't have to divide per A and B. It is one big phase with a small gradual evolution. And these two types, or those two groups of tombs, were in fact very alike. They were only different in the underground, smaller or bigger construction, but they belong to the same period. They are contemporary. Piercy is another thing, but my time is up. They're saying it very loud in big letters, so I can't escape it anymore. Some of the things, some of these square shapes do continue, but on a very limited scale at the door. It's not the standard shape anymore. And to finally, I'd like to thank all the people who are engaged in this project and aided, and a special mention also, I think, for Ernie Harnik, who most of you know, have worked with, or at least have conversed with him. He had an incredible knowledge, and sadly passed away in 2016. So I hope you didn't regret missing your lunch.